Some bonds reach deeper than sight can ever go. In a world that often judges strength by what the eyes can see, the most powerful connections happen in places the heart understands best. In the dusty corrals of Cedar Ridge, a magnificent stallion named Ghost has become legend not for his speed or beauty, but for his refusal to let any man ride him. Dozens of cowboys have tried to break this wild horse, and dozens have been thrown to the dirt. The townspeople whisper that Ghost is cursed, untamable, meant to run free forever. Then one quiet morning, Levi Boone steps into the corral. The war took his sight, but left him with something far more valuable, the ability to see with his heart. What happens next between this blind cowboy and the wildest horse in the territory will challenge everything everyone thought they knew about trust and healing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered streets of Cedar Ridge as Levi Boone made his careful way to the general store. His walking stick tapped a familiar rhythm against the wooden boardwalk, a sound the townspeople had grown accustomed to over the past 2 years. In his vest pocket, wrapped in a piece of soft leather, lay his most treasured possession, a tarnished cavalry medal bearing the words, "For valor in battle." It had been polished smooth by years of fingers tracing its edges, first in pride, then in remembrance, and now in quiet acceptance of what was and what would never be again. Levi had arrived in Cedar Ridge on a supply wagon, his worldly possessions fitting into a single worn saddlebag. The war had ended for him at Antietam, where a Confederate artillery shell had exploded close enough to steal his sight, but far enough away to leave him breathing. The army doctors in Washington had been kind but practical. Here was a pension, there was a train ticket west, and good luck to you, soldier. At 34, Levi Boone had found himself adrift in a world that suddenly seemed to have no place for a blind cavalry officer. Cedar Ridge was the kind of town that existed because it had to, not because anyone particularly wanted it there. Nestled in a valley between rolling hills that stretched toward the Montana Territory, it served as a way station for cattle drives and a supply point for scattered ranches. The main street boasted a dozen buildings of varying degrees of permanence, the bank built of stone and confidence, the saloon constructed from hope and raw timber, and everything else somewhere in between. Martha Henley ran the general store with the efficiency of a drill sergeant and the heart of someone who had buried 3 children before their 5th birthdays. She had taken to Levi immediately, not out of pity but out of recognition. She understood what it meant to navigate a world that had fundamentally changed without asking your permission. "Morning, Levi," she called, as the bell above the door announced his arrival. "Got your usual order ready, plus something extra I thought you might appreciate." Levi folded his walking stick and tucked it under his arm. "You spoil me, Martha. What's the something extra?" "Letter came for you yesterday on the evening stage. Postmark from back east." Martha's voice carried that careful neutrality people used when they weren't sure if news was good or bad. "From the Veterans Administration, looks like." The medal in Levi's pocket seemed to grow heavier. He had been expecting this letter, some final bureaucratic closing of his military file, most likely. "Much obliged. Mind if I sit a spell while you gather my supplies?" "Course not. Take the chair by the window. Gets the best morning light." It was a kindness Martha offered without thinking, this reference to light and what it meant to see. Most people in town had learned to dance around such things, editing their speech until conversations felt stilted and unnatural. But Martha spoke to him as she always had, and Levi appreciated her for it more than she could know. As Martha bustled about filling his order, Levi listened to the familiar sounds of Cedar Ridge waking up. Old Pete McCready's wagon wheels needed greasing. They squeaked the same protest every morning as he headed out to check his fence lines. The blacksmith's hammer was already ringing against steel, a steady percussion that spoke of horses needing shoes and tools needing mending. From the direction of the schoolhouse came the faint sound of children's voices reciting their morning lessons, led by Miss Sarah Miller's patient encouragement. Sarah Miller had been one of the few people in town who had spoken to Levi as if his blindness were simply another fact about him, like his height or the color of his hair. She had arrived in Cedar Ridge the same year as Levi, hired to teach the town's children after the previous schoolmaster had decided that frontier life disagreed with his constitution. Where others saw Levi as a figure deserving of either pity or cautious respect, Sarah saw him as a man with stories worth hearing and opinions worth considering. That school teachers got her children practicing their arithmetic by counting fence posts this morning, Martha observed, wrapping his coffee beans in brown paper. Takes them on walks for lessons. Novel idea, if you ask me. Miss Miller has a gift for making learning seem less like work, Levi agreed. He had encountered her teaching methods firsthand during his walks around town. Once, she had stopped him to ask if he might explain to her students how cavalry units maintained formation during night marches. It had been the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge that someone had asked him about his military experience, not out of polite obligation, but genuine curiosity. The bell above the door chimed again, and Levi recognized the heavy footsteps of Tom Bradley, who owned the largest ranch in the county and served as the town's unofficial mayor. Bradley was a good man who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions and living with their consequences. "Morning, Martha," Levi. Bradley's voice carried an undercurrent of tension that made Levi turn his head toward the sound. "Bad business out at the Morrison place yesterday." Martha's hands stilled in their wrapping. "What kind of bad business, Tom?" "That black and white stallion of theirs threw another rider. Young Jimmy Crawford from over Billings way. Thought he was hot stuff with horses." Bradley removed his hat and ran fingers through graying hair. "Boy's lucky to be breathing. Doc says he'll mend, but it'll be weeks before he's walking right again." Levi had heard whispers about the Morrison stallion since arriving in town. Ghost, they called him, on account of his coloring and the way he seemed to appear and disappear in the pastures, like something not quite of this world. The horse had belonged to Captain James Fletcher, a career cavalry officer who had retired to ranching after 20 years of military service. Fletcher had died the previous winter. Heart gave out while mending fence, they said, and left his property to a nephew back in Kansas who had no interest in frontier life. The nephew had sold the land to the Morrisons, but couldn't figure out what to do with Fletcher's prize stallion. "How many riders has that horse put in the dirt now?" Martha asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Jimmy Crawford makes 7 since Fletcher passed," Bradley replied. "All good horsemen, mind you. That animal's got something in him that won't be settled by normal methods." Levi fingered the medal in his pocket. Captain Fletcher. The name stirred something in his memory, though he couldn't quite place it. There had been so many officers during the war, and the months leading up to his injury remained hazy in his mind. "What'll happen to the horse?" Levi asked. Bradley sighed. "Morrison's talking about putting him down. Says he can't afford to have a killer on his property. And he sure can't afford the doctor bills every time some fool cowboy thinks he can succeed where others failed." He paused, then added with the careful tone of a man choosing his words deliberately, "Though I suppose if someone could gentle that animal, Morrison might be willing to sell instead of shoot." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, Bradley's casual mention of a solution felt less than accidental. Levi had been a cavalry officer. After all, he understood horses, even if he could no longer see them. "Tom Bradley," Martha said with a warning in her voice, "don't you go putting ideas in people's heads." "Just making conversation, Martha, just making conversation," but Levi was already thinking. In the 2 years since arriving in Cedar Ridge, he had felt like a man existing in the margins of life, grateful for kindness but contributing little in return. His pension provided enough for basic needs, but it did not provide purpose. It did not provide the sense of being useful that had defined his adult life until a piece of Confederate iron had redefined it for him. "This Captain Fletcher," Levi said carefully. "What do you know about him?" Bradley settled into another chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "Good man, fair dealer, kept to himself mostly, but helped neighbors when needed. Had a way with horses that was something to see. That stallion of his was gentle as a lamb under Fletcher's hand. Any idea why the horse changed after Fletcher died? Could be grief, I suppose. Animals form bonds stronger than most people give them credit for. Could be the nephew spooked him somehow before selling to Morrison. Or could be that without Fletcher's hand to guide him, the horse just reverted to his wild nature." Bradley stood to leave. "Why do you ask, Levi?" The metal seemed to pulse against Levi's chest like a second heartbeat. "Just curious, I suppose." After Bradley left, Martha continued her work in silence for several minutes. Finally, she spoke without looking up from the ledger where she recorded purchases. "My husband was a good man with horses," she said quietly. "Always said the ones that fight the hardest are usually the ones that have been hurt the worst. Said they're not mean, just scared." Levi nodded, understanding that Martha was offering more than casual observation. In the language of small towns, she was giving him permission to consider what Tom Bradley had suggested without making him feel foolish for considering it. "Martha, what do you know about Captain Fletcher's war service?" "Not much. Heard he served with cavalry units back east. Lost his son in the war. Boy was infantry, killed at Shiloh. Think that's when Fletcher decided he'd had enough of fighting and came west to start over." The conversation moved on to other topics: the weather, the upcoming harvest, news from the territorial capital. But Levi's mind remained fixed on the image of a stallion that had forgotten how to trust, and a dead cavalry officer who might hold the key to understanding why. As he walked home with his supplies, the medal in his pocket seemed to carry weight beyond its modest size, as if it were trying to remind him of something just beyond the reach of memory. That evening, sitting on the narrow porch of his rented room behind the boarding house, Levi opened the letter from the Veterans Administration. As expected, it was bureaucratic closure, a final accounting of his service record, and confirmation that his pension would continue as long as he remained in good standing. But attached to the official correspondence was something unexpected, a personal note from his former commanding officer, Colonel William Hayes. "Boone." The note began in Hayes's distinctive handwriting. "Trust this finds you well. Heard you'd settled in Montana Territory. Wanted you to know that James Fletcher passed last winter. Good officer, as you well remember. Thought you should know, given your history together. He spoke of you often in those final months before Antietam. Said you had the makings of a fine cavalry officer if the war hadn't cut things short. Hope you're finding peace in your new circumstances. Respectfully, W. Hayes, Colonel, U.S. Cavalry." The letter trembled in Levi's hands as memory rushed back like water through a broken dam. Captain James Fletcher, not just any cavalry officer, but his captain. The man who had taught him to read terrain from the saddle, who had shown him how to gentle a spooked horse with voice and patience rather than force. The man whose final order had been for Levi to take a message to the rear lines, a task that had put him directly in the path of the artillery shell that changed everything. Fletcher had saved his life by sending him away from the main fighting, and Levi had never had the chance to thank him. Now Fletcher was dead, and his horse was fighting every man who tried to ride him, as if waiting for someone who would never come. Levi folded the letter carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket next to the medal. Tomorrow, he decided, he would walk out to the Morrison ranch and see this stallion for himself. Not to ride, he wasn't fool enough to think blindness was no obstacle to horsemanship, but perhaps to understand what Fletcher's horse was trying to say to a world that seemed determined not to listen. The night air carried the distant sound of the stallion's neighing, wild and mournful, echoing across the valley like a bugle call that no one could answer. But Levi listened, and in that sound he heard something that others had missed. Not defiance, but longing. Not anger, but grief. It was a sound he recognized, because he had been making it himself for 2 years, just not out loud. The next morning brought news that would change everything for both Levi Boone and the stallion called Ghost. Word spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire that Jimmy Crawford had taken a turn for the worse during the night. What had seemed like painful but manageable injuries had revealed themselves as something more serious, internal bleeding that Doc Hartwell feared might prove fatal if the young man wasn't moved to a proper hospital in Billings. By the time Levi made his way to the general store for his morning coffee, a crowd had already gathered outside Tom Bradley's office. The voices carried that particular tension of people trying to solve a problem that had grown beyond their ability to manage. Through the open window, Levi could hear Morrison's voice rising above the others. "I won't have another man's death on my conscience," Morrison was saying. "That horse is a killer, pure and simple. I should have put him down months ago." "Now hold on, Carl." Bradley's voice carried the authority of a man trying to keep a difficult situation from becoming impossible. "Let's not make decisions in haste we might regret later." Levi paused outside the window, his walking stick held loosely in his hand. The challenge rope, a worn lasso that had belonged to his father, hung coiled at his side, as it had every day since arriving in Cedar Ridge. His father had taught him to rope cattle during summers spent on his uncle's ranch in Texas, back when the future had seemed full of clear horizons and simple choices. The rope had followed him into military service, and through the war, a tangible connection to skills that made him useful, regardless of what else might be happening around him. "The animal's too dangerous to keep," Morrison continued. "Jimmy Crawford's barely 19 years old, got his whole life ahead of him if he lives through this. All because I was fool enough to think someone could ride that devil horse. What about posting a reward?" This voice belonged to Sarah Miller, and Levi felt his chest tighten with unexpected emotion at the sound. "Instead of destroying the animal, what if you offered payment to anyone who could gentle him properly? Give someone incentive to try a different approach." "Miss Miller," Morrison replied with the patient tone men used when explaining practical matters to well-meaning women. 7 men have tried to ride that horse. 7 good horsemen have been thrown, and now one of them might die from it. What makes you think an 8th attempt would end any different?" "Because," Sarah said firmly, "sometimes it takes finding the right person instead of just finding another person." Levi felt something stir within him that he hadn't experienced since before the war, the sensation of a challenge presenting itself that demanded to be met. He thought of Fletcher, of the letter from Colonel Hayes, of the mournful neighing that had drifted across the valley the night before. Without fully realizing what he was doing, he pushed open the door to Bradley's office and stepped inside. The conversation stopped, as if someone had thrown a blanket over it. Levi could feel the weight of stares, could sense the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere that came when people weren't sure how to react to an unexpected development. "Levi," Bradley said carefully, "good morning. We were just discussing the Morrison situation." "I heard." Levi moved further into the room, using his walking stick to navigate around chairs and find a clear space near the wall. "Mr. Morrison, I'd like to make you an offer." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to touch. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice carried the weariness of a man who had been dealing with an impossible problem for too long. "What kind of offer, Mr. Boone?" "Give me 30 days to work with your stallion. If I can gentle him enough that he'll accept a rider, a willing rider who understands what he's getting into, then you sell him to me for a fair price. If I can't, then I'll pay for the bullet to put him down myself." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Levi could feel the room's reaction without seeing it. Someone, it sounded like Pete McCready, let out a low whistle of disbelief. Morrison's breathing had quickened, as if he were trying to process something that made no sense. "Mr. Boone," Morrison said slowly, "with all due respect, that horse has thrown seasoned cowboys who've been riding since they could walk. Men with full sight and 30 years of experience with difficult animals. You're talking about—" "I'm talking about trying something different," Levi interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority he had once used to give orders to cavalry units. Those 7 men who were thrown, did any of them spend time just being around the horse, getting to know him before trying to climb on his back? Getting to know him? Morrison's voice held a note of incredulity. Mr. Boone, he's a horse, not a person you strike up a conversation with over coffee. That's where you're wrong. Levi shifted his weight, feeling the challenge rope against his side like an old friend offering encouragement. Captain Fletcher didn't think of him as just a horse. Neither should we. The mention of Fletcher's name seemed to change something in the room's atmosphere. Levi heard chairs creak as people shifted position, felt the quality of attention focus more sharply on his words. "You knew Fletcher?" Bradley asked. "He was my commanding officer during the war, before Antietam." Levi's hand found the medal in his vest pocket. "He taught me that every horse has its own language, its own way of understanding the world. The key isn't forcing them to understand ours, it's learning to understand theirs." Sarah's voice came from somewhere near the window. "What are you proposing exactly?" Levi turned toward the sound of her voice, grateful for the support he heard there. "I'm proposing that maybe this horse isn't mean or crazy or cursed. Maybe he's grieving. Maybe he's been waiting for someone who speaks his language instead of just trying to dominate him." "And you think you can speak his language?" Morrison's question wasn't mocking, but it carried profound skepticism. "I think I can learn to. I think I have to try." Levi straightened to his full height, letting military bearing steady his voice. "Mr. Morrison, that horse belonged to a good man who understood him. Fletcher's gone, but whatever he knew about that animal didn't die with him. It's still there, waiting for someone patient enough to discover it." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of desperate hope, fighting against practical fear. "Mr. Boone, if you're wrong, if that horse hurts you the way he hurt Jimmy Crawford, then that's my responsibility, not yours." Levi's words came with the finality of a man who had already committed himself completely. "But Mr. Morrison, if I'm right, then you've got a horse worth more than whatever you paid for him, and this town's got one less problem, keeping everyone awake at night." Bradley cleared his throat. "There'd have to be conditions, safety measures. We couldn't just turn you loose with that animal unsupervised." "Fair enough," Levi agreed, "but I work alone with him. No audience, no advice, no one trying to help unless I specifically ask for it. Whatever's going to happen between me and that horse needs to happen without distractions." The room fell silent again as Morrison considered the proposal. Levi could hear the man's breathing, could sense the internal struggle between hope and responsibility playing out in real time. 30 days, Morrison said finally. "But the first sign that horse is going to hurt you, the deal's off, and I put him down immediately. I won't have another man's injuries on my conscience." "Agreed." Levi extended his hand in the direction of Morrison's voice. "Thank you for giving him a chance." As handshakes were exchanged and practical details discussed, Levi felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war, the sense of purpose that came from having a mission that mattered. Whether he succeeded or failed, he would finally be doing something more than simply existing in the margins of other people's lives. Sarah Miller approached him as the crowd began to disperse. "Levi, what you're proposing, it's either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," he admitted. "But Miss Miller, sometimes the distance between brave and foolish is smaller than people think. What made you decide to try this?" Levi considered the question, thinking of Fletcher's letter, of the mournful sound that had drifted across the valley the night before, of 2 years spent feeling like a man whose useful life had ended too soon. "I suppose," he said quietly, "I recognized something in that horse's situation that reminded me of my own. Sometimes you have to take a chance on being understood, even when everyone else has given up trying." As he walked home that afternoon, the challenge rope at his side felt less like a relic from his past and more like a tool for his future. Tomorrow would begin 30 days that would determine not just the fate of Fletcher's Stallion, but the shape of whatever life Levi Boone was meant to build in the shadow of the war that had changed him forever. 3 days before Levi was scheduled to begin working with Ghost, Sarah Miller appeared at his door, carrying a bundle wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The morning was crisp with the promise of autumn, and Levi could smell the change in the air, that particular scent of leaves beginning to turn and wood smoke from chimneys being used for the first time since spring. "I brought you something," Sarah said without preamble. "May I come in?" Levi stepped aside to let her enter his modest quarters behind the boarding house. The room was spartanly furnished, but meticulously organized everything in its place, so that blindness became merely an inconvenience rather than a constant obstacle. Sarah moved carefully, noting the precise arrangement that allowed Levi to navigate his space with confidence. "What you did the other day," she began, settling into the room's single chair, while Levi remained standing by the window. "It reminded me of something my father would have done." Sarah unwrapped the bundle to reveal a pair of well-worn riding boots, their leather dark with age and use, but still solid and serviceable. "These belonged to my father. He died when I was 16. Horse threw him during a storm, broke his neck, but before that happened, he was the finest horseman I ever knew. Patient, gentle, understood that animals respond to how you feel about them, not just what you do to them." Levi reached out to touch the boots, his fingers tracing the worn leather. "Sarah, I can't accept these. They're too valuable, too personal." "They're exactly what you need," she replied firmly. "My father always said that the right boots were as important as the right horse. These boots walked thousands of miles with a man who never met a horse he couldn't understand, given enough time and patience." The boots fit perfectly, as if they had been waiting for Levi's feet. As he laced them up, Sarah continued speaking, her voice carrying the weight of memories she rarely shared. "After my father died, people said I should be afraid of horses, said it was natural for a girl to be skittish around them after what happened. But what they didn't understand was that my father didn't die because horses are dangerous. He died because he took a chance in bad weather to help a neighbor, and sometimes, when you take chances, things go wrong. The horse didn't kill him. Circumstances did." Levi understood what she was trying to tell him. In the 3 days since accepting Morrison's challenge, he had heard plenty of well-meaning advice about the dangers of what he was attempting. Doc Hartwell had stopped by to discuss head injuries and broken bones. Tom Bradley had offered to post men nearby in case of emergency. Even Martha Henley had expressed her concerns about the wisdom of a blind man working with an animal that had already hospitalized 7 riders. "People are worried about you," Sarah observed, as if reading his thoughts. "But I think most of them are worried about the wrong things." "What do you mean?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "They're worried that the horse might hurt your body. I'm worried that failing might hurt your spirit." It was a perceptive observation, and one that cut directly to the heart of Levi's own fears. The physical dangers of working with Ghost were real but manageable. He had survived worse than anything a horse could do to him. But the possibility of public failure, of confirming everyone's assumption that a blind man had no business attempting something so ambitious, felt far more threatening. "Tell me about the nightmares," Sarah said quietly. The request surprised him. Levi had mentioned his war dreams to no one in Cedar Ridge, but somehow Sarah had perceived what others missed. Perhaps it was her training as a teacher, or perhaps it was simply the insight that came from having experienced loss herself. "How did you know?" "You have the look of someone who doesn't sleep well. I recognize it because I had it for years after my father died. The way you hold yourself during the day, like you're preparing for something difficult. The way you listen to every sound, as if you're expecting trouble." Levi moved to the window and stood looking out at nothing, his hands clasped behind his back in an unconscious echo of military bearing. "They're not always about the explosion," he said finally. "Sometimes they're about the moments just before, the sounds of battle, the feeling of being responsible for men's lives, the weight of making decisions that matter. Do you miss it? The responsibility, I mean." "Every day." The admission came easier than he had expected. "For 20 years, from the time I was 14 and lied about my age to join the army until the day that shell went off. I knew exactly who I was and what I was supposed to be doing. I was a soldier, and then I was an officer, and men depended on me to make good decisions under pressure. And now I feel like I'm playing a role that doesn't quite fit. The grateful pensioner, the object of charity, the man who used to be useful. Levi turned away from the window. This thing with Ghost, it's probably the first time since Antietam that I've felt like myself. Sarah stood and moved to the window beside him. My father used to say that a horse always knows whether you believe in yourself. Said they can sense doubt faster than they can sense fear, and they respond to both the same way. By running away, or by fighting. My father said that a horse that fights is usually just a horse that's scared and doesn't see any other options. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, two people who understood what it meant to navigate a world that had been fundamentally altered by loss. Finally, Sarah spoke again. Levi, what are you going to do if this works? If you actually manage to gentle Ghost, what comes next? It was a question he had been avoiding, partly because success seemed so uncertain, and partly because he wasn't sure he was ready to hope for anything beyond the immediate challenge. But wearing his father's boots and standing next to a woman who believed in the possibility of second chances, he found himself willing to consider what might come after. I suppose I'd try to find other horses that need help, other situations where patience might work better than force. He paused, then added with a slight smile, maybe I'd discover that there's more than one way to serve, even after you think your fighting days are over. The next morning, Levi walked out to the Morrison Ranch alone, carrying nothing but his walking stick, the challenge rope, and the confidence that came from wearing boots that had belonged to a man who understood horses. The ranch sat on a rise overlooking the valley, its buildings arranged with the practical efficiency of people who worked the land for a living rather than for show. Morrison met him at the gate, his manner formal but not unfriendly. "Mr. Boone, I want you to know that Jimmy Crawford's condition has stabilized. Doc thinks he'll recover, though it'll be months before he's back to normal." "I'm glad to hear it," Levi replied, and meant it. "Where is Ghost now?" "In the back corral, away from the other horses. We've had to keep him separated. Since Fletcher died, he spooks the others when he gets worked up." Morrison's voice carried a note of regret. "I should warn you, he's been more agitated since word got around town about what you're planning. It's like he knows something's coming." They walked toward the corral in silence, Morrison occasionally offering quiet descriptions of the terrain and obstacles. As they approached, Levi could hear the stallion moving restlessly, hooves striking earth in an irregular rhythm that spoke of nervous energy. "There he is," Morrison said softly. Even without sight, Levi could sense the horse's presence, the sound of breathing, the rustle of movement, the particular quality of attention that came from being watched by an intelligent animal. Ghost was magnificent, Morrison had told him, black with white markings that gave him his name, standing nearly 16 hands with the muscular build of a horse, bred for both strength and speed. "I'll leave you to it," Morrison said. "But Mr. Boone, be careful. That animal's been hurt and angry for months. He might not be willing to listen to reason." As Morrison's footsteps faded, Levi approached the corral fence and stood quietly, making no attempt to enter or even speak. He simply existed in Ghost's presence, letting the horse become accustomed to his scent and his stillness. Minutes passed without movement from either man or animal. Finally, Levi spoke, his voice carrying the calm authority he had once used to steady nervous soldiers before battle. "Hello, Ghost," he said quietly. "My name is Levi Boone, and I knew Captain Fletcher. I think you and I need to have a conversation." For the first week, Levi did nothing more than show up. Every morning at sunrise, he would walk to the Morrison Ranch and position himself outside Ghost's corral, sometimes sitting on the fence rail, sometimes standing quietly in the shade of the nearby oak tree. He brought no equipment, made no sudden movements, and spoke only in the same calm voice he had used that first day. Ghost's initial reaction had been exactly what Levi expected, snorting, pawing, positioning himself as far from the fence as the corral allowed. The stallion would watch Levi with the hyper-alert stillness of an animal that had learned to treat all human contact as a potential threat. But as the days passed, something began to shift in the quality of that attention. On the fourth day, Levi noticed that Ghost no longer retreated to the far side of the corral when he arrived. Instead, the horse would position himself at a middle distance, close enough to observe, but far enough to escape if necessary. It was progress measured in feet rather than miles, but it was progress nonetheless. Sarah visited on the fifth day, bringing lunch and curiosity about Levi's methods. She found him sitting motionless on the fence rail, while Ghost stood perhaps 20 feet away. The two of them engaged in what looked like a staring contest between a blind man and a wary horse. "How do you know if you're making progress when you can't see his reactions?" she asked quietly, settling beside him on the rail. "I listen," Levi replied without moving. His breathing patterns, the way he moves his feet, the sounds he makes when he's thinking versus when he's agitated. Right now he's curious about you being here, but he's not afraid. 5 days ago, a second human voice would have sent him to the far corner. Sarah watched Ghost for several minutes, noting the way the stallion seemed to be studying them rather than simply enduring their presence. "What are you waiting for?" "For him to make the first move toward connection. Every horse that's been forced on him so far has started with the assumption that the human gets to decide when and how contact happens. I'm trying to let him know that this time will be different." As if summoned by Levi's words, Ghost took 3 deliberate steps closer to the fence. Sarah held her breath, but Levi remained perfectly still, acknowledging the horse's movement only with a slight nod of his head. "Good morning, Ghost," he said quietly. "Thank you for trusting us enough to come closer." The breakthrough came on the 7th day, and it started with something neither Levi nor anyone else had expected: Ghost's own grief, making itself known in a way that couldn't be ignored. Levi arrived that morning to find the stallion standing at the fence nearest to where Captain Fletcher's house had stood, before the Morrisons tore it down to make room for their own expansion. Ghost was making a sound Levi had never heard from a horse before, a low, keening noise that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. It was unmistakably the sound of mourning, as clear and heartbreaking as any human expression of loss. Without thinking, Levi approached the fence directly, his walking stick forgotten, his hands extended not to grab or control, but simply to offer presence. "I know," he said softly. "I miss him too." At the sound of Fletcher's name, Ghost's head turned sharply toward Levi. For the first time since they had begun this strange dance of patience and trust, the stallion moved directly toward the human at the fence. He stopped just beyond arm's reach, close enough that Levi could feel the warmth of his breathing, close enough to smell the complex scent of horse and hay, and something indefinable that might have been loneliness. "He was a good man," Levi continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "He saved my life during the war, you know. Sent me away from the fighting just before the artillery came down. I never got to thank him for that." Ghost stepped closer, near enough now that Levi could have reached out and touched him. But he didn't. Instead, he simply stood and let the horse examine him, sniffing his clothes, his hair, the familiar scent of leather and metal that still clung to him despite 2 years of civilian life. "You smell it, don't you?" Levi asked. "The war, the cavalry. You remember those smells from when Fletcher came home?" He paused, then added with quiet wonder, "You remember me." It was an impossible thought, but the more Levi considered it, the less impossible it seemed. Fletcher had mentioned his men often, had talked about the war and the horses they rode and the bonds that formed between soldiers and their mounts. Ghost might not remember Levi specifically, but he would remember the combination of scents and sounds that meant cavalry, that meant the world Fletcher had known before coming west to heal from his own war wounds. Around Ghost's neck, barely visible beneath his dark mane, Levi's exploring fingers found something unexpected, the remnants of a broken bridle, its leather cracked and its metal fittings tarnished with age. This wasn't Fletcher's gentle equipment, but something harsher, something that spoke of force rather than partnership. "Who did this to you?" Levi asked, his fingers carefully examining the damaged leather. "This isn't Fletcher's work. He would never have used something so cruel." As if the touch had unlocked a memory, Ghost suddenly shied away, his breathing quickening with what Levi recognized as remembered fear. But instead of retreating to the far side of the corral, as he once would have, the stallion stopped after just a few steps and turned back toward Levi, as if torn between flight and the desire for understanding. "Easy," Levi murmured, making no move to follow. "I'm not going to hurt you. Nobody's going to force anything on you anymore." Slowly, carefully, he began to work at the broken bridle, his fingers finding the buckles and straps that had been left to cut into Ghost's neck for who knew how long. The leather was embedded deeply enough that it would require patience to remove without causing pain. But Levi had patience in abundance. "Morrison," he called toward the house, not taking his attention away from Ghost. "Could you bring me some oil and a sharp knife? This horse has been wearing damaged tack that needs to come off." Morrison appeared with the requested tools, his eyes widening as he saw how close Ghost was allowing Levi to work. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "In all the months he's been here, he's never let anyone get within 10 feet of him." "This bridle," Levi said as he began the careful work of cutting away the damaged leather. "This isn't Fletcher's equipment. Where did it come from?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession he'd been avoiding. "That would be from Fletcher's nephew. Boy came out from Kansas to settle the estate, took one look at Ghost, and decided he needed breaking proper. Brought in some rough gear from town and tried to force a bit into the horse's mouth. And?" Levi's voice carried a dangerous quiet that Morrison recognized as barely controlled anger. "Horse fought him every step of the way. Nephew finally gave up, but he left that bridle on, said it would teach the animal some respect. I should have removed it myself, but every time I tried to get close enough, Ghost would go wild." As the damaged bridle came away in pieces, Ghost stood perfectly still, as if he understood that this discomfort was temporary and necessary. When the last of the cruel leather was removed, he shook his head vigorously, then turned to look directly at Levi, with what could only be described as gratitude. "There," Levi said quietly, running his hand along Ghost's neck, where the bridle had left marks in his coat. "That's better, isn't it?" For answer, Ghost stepped closer still and rested his great head against Levi's shoulder. It was a gesture of trust, so complete, so unexpected, that Morrison let out an audible gasp of surprise. "I've been around horses my whole life," Morrison said wonderingly, "and I've never seen anything like that. It's like he's been waiting for you specifically." As Levi stood with Ghost's warm weight against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of the horse's breathing and the profound peace that came with mutual trust, he began to understand that this connection was about more than simply gentling a difficult animal. Ghost had been waiting, not for any rider, but for someone who understood that healing required patience, that trust could not be forced, and that sometimes the strongest bonds were forged not through dominance, but through shared recognition of loss and the quiet determination to move beyond it. "Tomorrow," Levi said quietly, speaking as much to himself as to Ghost or Morrison, "we'll see if you're ready to remember what it feels like to be partners instead of adversaries." But even as he spoke, he knew that the real work was already done. Everything that followed would simply be the logical extension of what had been established in this moment. Two creatures who had been wounded by the world, finding in each other the possibility of wholeness. The morning after removing Ghost's broken bridle, Levi arrived at the corral, carrying something he hadn't touched since before the war, his father's harmonica, its silver surface worn smooth by years of handling. The instrument had been with him through every campaign, tucked into his breast pocket where it could catch the rhythm of his heartbeat during long marches and quiet nights around military campfires. Ghost greeted him at the fence with a soft whicker, the first vocal acknowledgement the stallion had offered to any human since Fletcher's death. It was a sound of recognition, perhaps even welcome, and it filled Levi with a warmth he hadn't felt in months. "Good morning, friend," Levi said quietly, letting himself into the corral for the first time. Ghost watched his movements, but showed no signs of alarm, even when Levi settled himself cross-legged in the dirt near the center of the enclosure. "I brought something I thought you might like to hear." He raised the harmonica to his lips and began to play not any particular melody, but the kind of gentle, wandering tune that soldiers made up during quiet moments between battles. The notes drifted across the morning air, simple and peaceful, carrying undertones of longing and home and the universal human need for beauty in the midst of hardship. Ghost's reaction was immediate and profound. The stallion moved closer, his ears pricked forward with intense interest, his breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the music. When Levi paused between phrases, Ghost would step nearer, and when the music resumed, he would stand perfectly still, as if afraid that movement might break the spell. "Fletcher used to play, didn't he?" Levi asked during one of the pauses. "Not harmonica, maybe, but something. Music was important to him." As if in answer, Ghost moved to within touching distance and lowered his great head until it was level with Levi's shoulder. The gesture was unmistakably one of companionship, the kind of relaxed closeness that horses offered only to those they trusted completely. Levi continued to play, letting the music create a cocoon of calm around them both. As he played, he began to understand something fundamental about Ghost's nature. This wasn't a wild horse in the way most people understood wildness. This was a domestic animal who had been trained to trust and then betrayed by that trust, who had learned to defend himself by rejecting all human contact rather than risk further betrayal. "The nephew hurt you," Levi said quietly between songs, "not just with that bridle, but in other ways too. Scared you, maybe hit you when you wouldn't submit fast enough." Ghost's ear flicked at the words, and Levi felt the stallion's breathing quicken slightly. "But before that, with Fletcher, you were gentle. You were a partner, not a conquest." The music session lasted nearly 2 hours, with Levi playing and Ghost gradually relaxing into a state of profound peace. By the end, the stallion was standing so close that Levi could feel the animal's warmth against his arm, could smell the sweet scent of hay and horse that meant safety and companionship. When Sarah arrived with lunch, she found them in this tableau-blind man and supposedly wild horse sharing space as if they had been companions for years rather than days. She approached quietly, not wanting to disturb the profound stillness that seemed to surround them. "My word," she whispered. "Levi, how did you know music would calm him?" "Fletcher was a cavalry officer," Levi replied without moving away from Ghost. "Military men often turn to music to process what they can't put into words. If Fletcher was trying to heal from his own war experiences, music might have been part of how he did it." Sarah settled herself on the fence rail, watching in wonder as Ghost acknowledged her presence with only the briefest glance before returning his attention to Levi. The transformation in the stallion was remarkable. Where once there had been suspicion and aggression, now there was curiosity and even affection. "The town's talking," Sarah said after a while. "Word's gotten around about what you accomplished yesterday, removing that bridle. People are starting to believe that maybe you really can gentle him." "Good," Levi replied, "because tomorrow we're going to try something that will require all the trust we've built so far." "What do you mean?" Levi reached out slowly and placed his hand on Ghost's neck, feeling the strong pulse beneath the warm coat. The stallion didn't flinch, didn't move away, didn't show any of the defensive behaviors that had characterized his interactions with humans for months. "Tomorrow," Levi said quietly, "I'm going to ask him if he remembers what it felt like to carry a rider who respected him." Sarah felt her breath catch. Levi, are you sure you're ready for that? It's only been a week since you started working with him. It's not about time, Sarah. It's about trust. Levi's fingers found a spot behind Ghost's ear that made the stallion lean into the touch with obvious pleasure. This horse doesn't need to be broken because he was never truly wild. He just needs to remember that not all humans are like Fletcher's nephew. That afternoon, Levi spent time simply moving around the corral while Ghost followed, the two of them developing a wordless communication based on subtle shifts in posture and breathing. When Levi moved left, Ghost moved left. When Levi stopped, Ghost stopped. It was a dance of mutual awareness that spoke of rapidly developing partnership. "You're remembering, aren't you?" Levi asked as they stood together near the fence, remembering what it was like when humans meant companionship instead of conflict. Ghost's answer came in the form of a gentle nudge against Levi's chest, followed by the kind of soft snuffling that horses use to explore interesting scents. The stallion was investigating Levi's clothes, his hair, the lingering traces of harmonica music that seemed to cling to him like cologne. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the corral, Levi made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of leaving as he had every previous evening, he settled himself in the corner of the enclosure with his back against the fence post. "I think I'll stay here tonight," he told Ghost. "If that's all right with you." Morrison appeared at the fence, drawn by the unusual sight of a man preparing to sleep in a corral with a horse that had hospitalized 7 riders. "Mr. Boone, are you sure that's wise? He might be calm now, but horses can spook at night sounds." "If he spooks, he spooks," Levi replied calmly. "But I don't think he will. I think he's been lonely for too long to turn away company when it's freely offered." As if to prove Levi's point, Ghost moved to a position near the fence where he could watch both the corral entrance and the man who had chosen to stay with him. The stallion's posture was relaxed, but alert, not the hypervigilance of fear, but the comfortable watchfulness of a guardian. Throughout the night, Levi woke periodically to find Ghost in different positions around the corral, always maintaining his protective watch, always ensuring that his human companion was safe. It was behavior that spoke of deeply ingrained loyalty, of a nature that wanted to serve and protect rather than rebel and fight. When morning came, Levi woke to find Ghost standing directly beside him. The stallion's great head lowered so that his warm breath stirred Levi's hair. It was a gesture of intimacy that would have been impossible just days before, a clear indication that the barriers between them had been not just lowered, but completely dissolved. "Good morning, partner," Levi said quietly, reaching up to stroke Ghost's neck. "Are you ready to show the world what we've learned about trust?" Ghost's response was to step back and wait, his posture suggesting readiness for whatever Levi might ask of him. The wild horse of Cedar Ridge legend was gone, replaced by something far more remarkable, a partner who understood that true strength came not from fighting against connection, but from choosing to embrace it. The white feather appeared on the 10th day, drifting down from Ghost's mane as he shook his head in the morning sunlight. Sarah, who had arrived early to witness what Levi had promised would be a significant milestone, watched the feather float to the ground with a sense of wonder that surprised her with its intensity. "Did you see that?" she asked quietly. "I felt it," Levi replied, his hand resting on Ghost's shoulder. "The way he moved, the sound it made. What was it?" "A white feather, perfectly formed. It just fell from his mane as if—" Sarah paused, searching for words to describe the moment, as if he was shedding something he no longer needed to carry. Levi nodded slowly, understanding the symbolism, even if he couldn't see it. "Grief has weight," he said. "When you're finally ready to let it go, sometimes your body knows before your mind does." They had been working together for over a week now, and the transformation in Ghost was nothing short of remarkable. The stallion, who had once retreated to the far corners of his corral, now sought out Levi's company, following him around the enclosure like a massive, devoted dog. More importantly, Ghost had begun to show signs of playfulness, nipping gently at Levi's shirt, tossing his head in mock defiance when asked to move, exhibiting the kind of spirited joy that healthy horses displayed when they felt safe and valued. But today was different. Today, Levi intended to ask Ghost to take the ultimate step in rebuilding their partnership. Not the violent subjugation that previous riders had attempted, but a voluntary acceptance of shared burden and mutual trust. "Are you certain about this?" Sarah asked, noting the way Ghost seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. The stallion's attention was focused entirely on Levi, his ears pricked forward with alert anticipation. "As certain as I can be about anything," Levi replied. "Sarah, what I'm about to try isn't about proving that a blind man can ride a difficult horse. It's about proving that partnership is stronger than domination." He moved to Ghost's side, running his hands along the stallion's flank in a gesture that had become familiar over their days together. Ghost stood perfectly still, his breathing steady and calm, showing none of the tension that had characterized his interactions with previous riders. "Easy, friend," Levi murmured, his voice carrying the same calm authority he had used with nervous soldiers before dangerous missions. "We're going to try something new today, but only if you're willing." What happened next would have seemed impossible to anyone who remembered Ghost's violent resistance to previous mounting attempts. Instead of tensing or shying away, the stallion actually shifted his position to make it easier for Levi to reach his back. It was a subtle movement, but one that spoke volumes about the level of trust that had developed between them. Levi placed his hands on Ghost's withers, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the warm coat. "If you don't want this," he said quietly, "all you have to do is move away. I won't chase you, won't force you, won't punish you for saying no." Ghost turned his head to look at Levi, and though the blind man couldn't see the expression in those dark eyes, Sarah could. What she saw there was not fear or anger, but something that looked remarkably like understanding, as if the stallion grasped exactly what was being asked of him, and was making a conscious choice to consent. Slowly, carefully, Levi eased himself up onto Ghost's back. There was no saddle, no bridle, nothing but the simple rope halter they had fashioned together from Levi's father's challenge rope. Ghost stood motionless as Levi settled into position, the stallion's breathing remaining steady and relaxed, even with the weight of a rider on his back for the first time since Fletcher's death. "There," Levi said softly, his hands resting lightly on Ghost's neck. "How does that feel?" For answer, Ghost took a single step forward, then another, his gait smooth and controlled. There was no bucking, no rearing, no attempt to dislodge his rider. Instead, there was something that looked almost like relief, as if the stallion had been waiting for months for someone to ask for his cooperation rather than demand his submission. Sarah watched in wonder as horse and rider moved around the corral in perfect harmony. Ghost's steps were measured and careful, his attention focused on the man on his back rather than on potential escape routes. For his part, Levi sat with the easy grace of someone who had spent years in the saddle, his hands light on the reins, his weight balanced in a way that suggested partnership rather than control. "This is extraordinary," Sarah breathed. "Levi, you're not riding him, you're dancing with him." It was an apt description. What was happening in the corral bore no resemblance to the violent contests of will that had characterized Ghost's encounters with previous riders. This was collaboration, mutual respect made manifest in the form of shared movement and purpose. As they completed their second circuit of the corral, Levi felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war, the pure joy of partnership with a horse that trusted him completely. Ghost's movements telegraphed his intentions through the saddle, allowing Levi to anticipate turns and changes of pace despite his blindness. In return, Levi's seat and hands communicated his own intentions so clearly that the stallion could respond almost before the signals were fully given. "He's magnificent," Sarah said as they passed near the fence where she stood. "Absolutely magnificent." But as beautiful as the moment was, it carried within it the seeds of new complications. Word of Levi's success had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, and the implications of a blind man successfully riding the territory's most notorious horse were beginning to create ripples that neither Levi nor Sarah had fully anticipated. Tom Bradley arrived at the ranch that afternoon, accompanied by several other townsmen, and wearing the expression of someone grappling with a situation that defied easy categorization. "Levi," Bradley said carefully, "what you've accomplished here, it's remarkable, but it's also raised some questions that need addressing." "What kind of questions?" Bradley glanced at the other men, clearly uncomfortable with his role as spokesman for whatever concerns they represented. "There's been talk. Some folks are saying that if a blind man can ride Ghost, then maybe the horse was never as dangerous as we thought. Maybe some of those injuries to previous riders could have been avoided if we'd tried different methods." Levi dismounted slowly, keeping one hand on Ghost's neck. The stallion remained calm, but Levi could sense a change in the atmosphere, the kind of tension that developed when people began looking for someone to blame for past mistakes. "Tom," Levi said carefully, "every one of those riders did what they thought was right based on what they knew at the time. No one could have predicted that Ghost was grieving rather than wild." "Maybe not," Bradley agreed. "But there's been talk about bringing in other difficult horses, maybe starting some kind of training program. People are saying, you've got a gift for this work." It was a conversation that Levi had been both hoping for and dreading. The success with Ghost had awakened possibilities. He had tried not to consider the chance to build something meaningful from the ruins of his military career, the opportunity to be useful in ways that didn't depend on sight or charity. But it also meant stepping fully into the light, accepting responsibility not just for Ghost's transformation, but for whatever came next. It meant committing to a future that would inevitably bring both new challenges and new opportunities for failure. "I'd need to think about it," Levi said finally. "This thing with Ghost, it wasn't just about method. It was about understanding his specific history, his particular needs." "Of course," Bradley replied. "But Levi, what you've done here has given people hope. Hope that problems can be solved without violence, that patience might be worth more than force. That's not something to take lightly." As the townsmen left and evening settled over the ranch, Levi remained in the corral with Ghost, the two of them sharing the comfortable silence that had become their trademark. The white feather lay where it had fallen that morning, a small symbol of transformation that seemed to hold within it the promise of everything that might yet be possible. "What do you think, partner?" Levi asked quietly, his hand resting on Ghost's neck. "Are we ready to help others find what we've found together?" Ghost's answer came in the form of a gentle nudge against Levi's chest, not the desperate seeking of a lonely animal, but the affectionate greeting of a true companion. It was a gesture that seemed to say that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as partners in the truest sense of the word. The revelation came in the form of a letter delivered by the Territorial Mail Service on a grey October morning, 3 weeks after Levi's first successful ride on Ghost. Sarah had arrived early to find Levi sitting motionless on the corral fence, the unopened envelope in his hands, his face bearing an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of confusion, wonder, and something that might have been recognition. "The postmark is from Topeka," Levi said quietly, "from a law firm I've never heard of." He held the envelope out to her. "Would you mind reading it? I have a feeling this is going to change everything." Sarah took the letter with trembling fingers, sensing from Levi's demeanor that whatever it contained was significant beyond the ordinary. She opened it carefully and began to read, her voice growing softer with each sentence. "Dear Mr. Boone," she began, "our firm represents the estate of Captain James Fletcher, late of Cedar Ridge, Montana Territory. We have recently completed the final inventory of Captain Fletcher's personal effects and discovered among his papers a sealed document bearing your name." Sarah paused, her eyes widening as she absorbed the next paragraph. "Levi, this is extraordinary. Fletcher left specific instructions about Ghost, about you. Read it, Levi said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of revelation. Captain Fletcher's final will contains the following provision. Should Levi Boone, formerly Sergeant Boone of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, ever find himself in need of purpose or livelihood, he is hereby granted ownership of the stallion known as Ghost, along with sufficient funds for the animal's care and training. This bequest is made in recognition of Sergeant Boone's service under my command, and in the belief that he alone possesses the understanding necessary to unlock Ghost's true potential. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to bend the morning air. Ghost, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, moved closer to the fence where Levi sat, his warm breath stirring the hair at the back of Levi's neck. "There's more," Sarah said softly. "Enclosed, you will find a sealed letter from Captain Fletcher, written in the final weeks of his life. We trust it will provide clarity regarding both the nature of this bequest and the extraordinary bond that existed between Captain Fletcher and the stallion in question." With shaking hands, Sarah opened the second envelope and unfolded a sheet of paper covered in the careful script of a man who chose his words with military precision. "My dear Boone," she read, "if you are reading this letter, then God willing, you have found your way to Ghost and discovered what I always hoped you would discover, that healing comes not through conquest, but through understanding." The letter went on to describe Fletcher's final months, his growing awareness that his health was failing, and his determination to ensure that Ghost would not suffer the fate that awaited many cavalry horses at the end of their service. But more than that, it revealed the depth of Fletcher's knowledge about both Levi and Ghost, and his belief that they were uniquely suited to help each other heal from the wounds that war had left on their souls. "You may not remember," Sarah continued reading, "but Ghost was present during many of our campaigns. He was my personal mount during the final year of the war, including the engagement at Antietam where you were wounded. In the chaos following the artillery barrage, Ghost carried you to safety before returning for me. In a very real sense, you owe your life to this horse, just as he owes his current existence to the bond of trust we built during our service together." Levi's hand moved instinctively to the medal in his vest pocket, the tarnished cavalry decoration that had carried him through 2 years of civilian uncertainty. Suddenly, fragments of memory began to coalesce, the sensation of being lifted, of powerful muscles moving beneath him, of hoofbeats that carried him away from the sound of battle and toward the safety of the field hospital. "He saved my life," Levi said wonderingly. "Not Fletcher Ghost. The horse carried me to safety after I was blinded." Sarah's voice trembled as she read Fletcher's final paragraphs. "I have watched Ghost grieve since arriving in Montana, just as I have watched you struggle to find your place in a world that seems to have no use for old cavalry officers. My hope is that by bringing you together, both of you might discover that your service is not ended, but transformed. Ghost needs a partner who understands that strength comes from gentleness, and you need a purpose that honors the skills you developed in service to your country." The letter concluded with practical details about the inheritance, a sum substantial enough to establish a small ranch, along with legal ownership of Ghost and Fletcher's remaining tack and equipment. But more than the material provisions, Fletcher had left them something invaluable: the knowledge that their connection was not accidental but intentional, not coincidental but destined. "All this time," Levi said, his voice filled with wonder, "I thought I was trying to gentle a wild horse. But Fletcher knew, he knew that Ghost was trying to gentle me." As if in response to his words, Ghost pushed his head against Levi's shoulder with unmistakable affection. The gesture carried new meaning now, weighted with the knowledge of shared history and mutual salvation. Sarah carefully folded the letters and placed them back in their envelopes. "Levi, do you understand what this means? Fletcher didn't just leave you a horse, he left you a calling. He believed you were meant to do this work, to help both horses and their riders find healing through partnership rather than domination. The implications began to settle over Levi like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The success with Ghost hadn't been beginner's luck or simple intuition, it had been recognition, the renewal of a bond forged in the crucible of war and refined through mutual need. Ghost hadn't been waiting for just anyone to understand him. He had been waiting specifically for Levi, the man whose life he had saved. The partner Fletcher had chosen to continue work that death had left unfinished. "There's something else," Sarah said, examining the legal documents more carefully. "The bequest includes a piece of land 40 acres on the other side of the valley, with water rights and grazing permits. Fletcher bought it in your name 2 months before he died." Levi felt the world tilt around him, as if everything he had thought he knew about his presence in Cedar Ridge was being rewritten. He hadn't stumbled into this town by accident. He had been guided here by the deliberate planning of a commanding officer who understood his men well enough to know what they would need even after the war ended. "Fletcher knew I would come here," Levi said slowly. "Somehow, he knew that I would end up in Cedar Ridge, and he made preparations." "More than that," Sarah replied, studying the final page of documents. "According to this, he's been sending letters to the Veterans Administration, asking them to direct any correspondence for you to Cedar Ridge instead of wherever you had been living previously. He engineered your arrival here, Levi. Everything that's happened, meeting Ghost, discovering your gift for this work, even meeting me, Fletcher, set it all in motion." As the full scope of Fletcher's planning became clear, Levi felt a mixture of gratitude and overwhelming responsibility. His former commander had not simply given him property and a horse, he had given him a future, a purpose, and most importantly, a partner who shared his understanding of what it meant to heal from wounds that couldn't be seen. "What happens now?" Sarah asked quietly. Levi stood slowly, his hand still resting on Ghost's neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath the warm coat. "Now we honor Fletcher's faith in us," he said. "We build something worthy of his sacrifice and his foresight." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Tom Bradley rode up to the corral, his face bearing the expression of a man carrying urgent news. "Levi," Bradley called. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development. Word about your success with Ghost has reached the territorial capital. There's a delegation riding in from Helena officials who want to discuss establishing some kind of official horse training program. They'll be here tomorrow morning." As Bradley rode away, Levi and Sarah stood in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what the day had brought. In the space of a few hours, Levi had gone from being a pensioned veteran, struggling to find purpose, to being the inheritor of a mission that connected his past service with his future calling. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked. Levi mounted Ghost in the smooth, practiced motion that had become second nature to them both. The stallion stood perfectly still, then began to move in response to pressure so subtle that Sarah could barely detect it. Together, they rode toward the gate of the corral, no longer practice partners but true companions, embarking on work that would define the rest of their lives together. "Ready or not," Levi replied, "it's time to find out what Fletcher really had in mind when he brought us together." The delegation from Helena arrived at dawn on a crisp November morning, their official bearing and formal attire creating a stark contrast to the simple practicality of frontier life. Commissioner Robert Harrison, Territorial Supervisor of Agricultural Development, led the group, accompanied by 2 territorial representatives and a man introduced as Dr. Marcus Webb, who claimed expertise in animal psychology and training methods. Levi had spent the previous evening reading and rereading Fletcher's letter, searching for guidance about how to proceed when the stakes suddenly became larger than one man and one horse. The letter had provided more than historical context. It had contained specific instructions about the methods Fletcher believed would work with other traumatized animals, along with detailed notes about the psychological principles underlying their success. "Gentlemen," Tom Bradley said as the officials gathered in Morrison's front yard, I'd like you to meet Levi Boone, the man whose work with the Morrison Stallion has attracted your attention. Commissioner Harrison was a man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to evaluating situations quickly and making decisions that affected large numbers of people. His initial assessment of Levi was polite but clearly skeptical. A blind veteran was not what he had expected when reports of innovative horse training methods reached his office. "Mr. Boone," Harrison said carefully, "we've received some remarkable reports about your work here. Perhaps you could demonstrate these methods so we can better understand what makes them effective." Dr. Webb stepped forward, his manner suggesting the kind of academic authority that often clashed with practical experience. "I should mention that I've studied the latest European methods of animal psychology. I'm particularly interested in seeing how your techniques compare to established scientific approaches." Levi felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came when his abilities were questioned, but Fletcher's letter had prepared him for this moment. The old captain had written about the resistance they would face from people who confused innovation with inexperience, who assumed that formal education was more valuable than hard-won wisdom. "Certainly," Levi replied. "But gentlemen, what you're about to see isn't a performance. It's a conversation between partners who've learned to trust each other completely." Sarah had arrived early, bringing with her a sense of calm support that helped steady Levi's nerves. She positioned herself where she could observe both the demonstration and the officials' reactions, her teacher's instincts alert for any signs that the situation might turn problematic. Ghost waited in the corral with the patient composure that had replaced his former agitation. The stallion seemed to sense that something significant was happening. His attention was focused entirely on Levi, his body language suggesting readiness for whatever might be asked of him. "Before we begin," Levi said, addressing the delegation, "I need you to understand that what you're going to see took weeks to achieve. It's not a trick or a technique that can be learned quickly. It's the result of time, patience, and mutual respect." He entered the corral, carrying nothing but Fletcher's original letter, now carefully folded and tucked into his shirt pocket next to his cavalry medal. Ghost approached immediately, greeting Levi with the kind of affectionate nuzzle that had become their morning ritual. "3 months ago," Levi said, his voice carrying clearly to the watching officials, "this horse had injured 7 riders and was scheduled to be destroyed as too dangerous for human contact. The assumption was that he was wild, untrainable, possibly vicious by nature." Dr. Webb made a note on his pad. "And you disagree with that assessment?" "Completely." Levi's hand found the spot behind Ghost's ear that never failed to produce a response of pleasure and trust. "This horse wasn't wild, he was grieving. He wasn't vicious. He was protecting himself from people who didn't understand what he needed." What followed was not so much a demonstration as a dance. Levi and Ghost moved through a series of exercises that showcased not domination but partnership. Ghost responded to signals so subtle that the watching officials had difficulty detecting them, yet his obedience was complete and clearly voluntary. The climax came when Levi mounted Ghost without saddle or bridle, using only the simple rope halter they had fashioned from his father's challenge rope. Horse and rider moved as one unit, Ghost responding to weight shifts and touch with the kind of sensitivity that spoke of absolute trust. "Remarkable," Commissioner Harrison murmured. "I've never seen anything quite like it." But Dr. Webb remained skeptical. "Mr. Boone, while your results with this particular animal are impressive, I question whether your methods would be effective with truly difficult cases. This horse may simply have a naturally docile temperament that previous handlers failed to recognize." Levi dismounted slowly, keeping one hand on Ghost's neck. Fletcher's letter had warned him about this type of response, the tendency of formally educated experts to dismiss practical success as lucky accident rather than replicable method. "Dr. Webb," Levi said quietly, "would you be willing to examine this horse's physical condition, specifically the scarring around his neck and shoulders?" As Dr. Webb conducted his examination, his expression gradually changed from skepticism to concern, and then to something approaching horror. The evidence of abuse was unmistakable: old rope burns, whip marks, the telltale signs of harsh treatment that had been hidden beneath Ghost's thick winter coat. "My God," Dr. Webb whispered, "this animal has been systematically brutalized. These injuries, some of them are recent enough to have been healing when you began working with him." "Fletcher's nephew," Levi explained to the delegation. "He tried to break Ghost using traditional methods: force, pain, intimidation. When the horse fought back, the nephew escalated the violence. By the time I began working with Ghost, he had every reason to hate and fear human contact." Commissioner Harrison studied Levi with new interest. "And yet you convinced him to trust again. How?" The answer came not from Levi, but from Sarah, who had been watching the proceedings with growing understanding of what was really at stake. "He didn't convince Ghost to trust," she said firmly. "He earned Ghost's trust by proving that he was different from everyone who had hurt him before. He showed patience instead of force, understanding instead of domination." Dr. Webb closed his examination notes and looked directly at Levi. "Mr. Boone, I owe you an apology. What you've accomplished here isn't just impressive, it's revolutionary. If these methods could be applied systematically—" "That's exactly what we're hoping," Commissioner Harrison interjected. "The territorial government has been struggling with problems related to horse training for cavalry remounts, civilian transportation, and agricultural work. Too many animals are being destroyed as untrainable when they might simply need different approaches." Levi felt the weight of opportunity settling on his shoulders like a familiar pack. Fletcher's letter had prepared him for this moment, had given him the confidence to believe that his experience was valuable enough to build upon. "Gentlemen," he said carefully, "what you're proposing would require significant resources: land, facilities, trained personnel. It would also require a fundamental shift in how people think about the relationship between humans and horses." "We're prepared to provide the resources," Harrison replied. "The question is whether you're prepared to take on the responsibility." As Levi considered his response, Ghost moved closer, resting his great head on Levi's shoulder in a gesture that had become their signature expression of partnership. The stallion's presence provided both comfort and clarity. This wasn't just about Levi's future, but about honoring Fletcher's vision and helping other wounded creatures find healing through understanding. "I'll need partners," Levi said finally. "People who understand that this work requires patience, empathy, and a willingness to see each animal as an individual rather than a problem to be solved." Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying the quiet determination that had characterized her teaching career. "You have at least one partner already, if you'll have me." The delegation spent the rest of the morning discussing practical details: funding, location, staffing, the legal framework needed to establish what would become the territory's first humane horse training facility. But for Levi, the most important moment came when he was alone again with Ghost, reading Fletcher's letter one more time in the quiet of the evening corral. "My dear Boone," the letter concluded, "I have faith that you will recognize this opportunity when it presents itself, just as I have faith that Ghost will help you find the courage to seize it. The work we began during the war, healing the wounds that conflict leaves on both men and animals, does not end with our military service. It simply takes new forms, requires new methods, demands new kinds of courage. Trust yourself, trust your partner, and trust that some bonds are strong enough to carry whatever weight the future places upon them." As night settled over Cedar Ridge, Levi made his final preparations for what would be the most important demonstration of his life, not just of his ability to work with Ghost, but of his readiness to transform a partnership born in grief into a calling that could bring healing to countless others who had lost their way in a world that seemed to have no place for their pain. The morning of the final demonstration dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass like scattered diamonds. The entire town of Cedar Ridge had gathered to witness what Commissioner Harrison had formally declared would be the decisive test of Levi's methods. Word had spread throughout the territory that a blind veteran had developed revolutionary techniques for training difficult horses, and people had traveled from as far as Billings and Great Falls to see for themselves whether the stories were true. Levi stood at the edge of the Morrison Ranch, listening to the murmur of voices and the stamp of horses' hooves as the crowd settled into position around the large corral that had been specially prepared for the demonstration. In his hands, he held a simple rope halter, not the fancy equipment that many trainers favored, but the kind of basic tool that respected rather than dominated, that asked for cooperation rather than demanded submission. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked quietly, taking her position beside him. Over the past weeks, she had become more than just a supporter of his work. She had become his partner in every sense that mattered. The person who understood both his methods and his mission well enough to help him articulate them to others. "As ready as I'll ever be," Levi replied, though his voice carried undertones of the nervousness he couldn't entirely suppress. "Sarah, if this goes wrong, if Ghost gets spooked by the crowd or reacts badly to the pressure—" "It won't," she interrupted firmly. "You and Ghost have built something too strong to be shaken by an audience. Trust what you've learned together." Dr. Webb approached them, his manner considerably more respectful than it had been during his initial assessment. His examination of Ghost's old injuries had fundamentally changed his understanding of what Levi had accomplished, transforming him from skeptic to advocate. "Mr. Boone," Dr. Webb said, "I want you to know that regardless of how today's demonstration proceeds, your work with Ghost has already proven the validity of your approach. What you've achieved is nothing short of miraculous." "It's not a miracle," Levi replied quietly. "It's just what happens when you take time to understand an animal's real needs instead of trying to force him to ignore them." Commissioner Harrison stepped forward, his official bearing softened by genuine admiration for what he had witnessed during his stay in Cedar Ridge. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called to the assembled crowd, "we're here today to observe methods of horse training that may revolutionize how we approach the relationship between humans and animals in our territory." The crowd settled into expectant silence as Levi entered the corral alone. Ghost stood at the far end of the enclosure, his attention focused entirely on his human partner, despite the presence of nearly 200 spectators. The stallion's composure was remarkable. Where once there had been agitation and fear, now there was calm, confidence, and obvious trust. Levi moved slowly across the corral, making no sudden movements, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "3 months ago," he began, "this horse was scheduled to be destroyed because people believed he was too dangerous to live. Today, I want to show you that he was never dangerous. He was just waiting for someone to speak his language." What followed was a masterclass in interspecies communication. Levi approached Ghost with the kind of relaxed confidence that comes only from absolute trust, and the stallion responded by moving toward him with equal confidence. Their greeting was gentle, affectionate, the kind of interaction that would have been impossible during Ghost's months of traumatic isolation. "The first thing you have to understand," Levi explained as he ran his hands over Ghost's neck and shoulders, "is that every horse is an individual with his own history, his own fears, his own needs. You can't train them all the same way any more than you can teach all children the same way." Sarah watched from the fence as Levi demonstrated the groundwork that had formed the foundation of his relationship with Ghost. The stallion responded to subtle cues, a shift in Levi's posture, a change in breathing pattern, the lightest touch of a hand with precision that looked almost magical to observers who didn't understand the hours of patient practice that had made it possible. "He's not obeying commands," Levi continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting. "He's participating in a conversation. The difference is that one approach creates fear-based compliance, while the other creates willing partnership." The crowd watched in fascination as horse and man moved through increasingly complex exercises, each one building on the trust and understanding that had been established through weeks of careful work. Ghost's responses were immediate and enthusiastic. This was an animal who had found joy in collaboration rather than simply submitted to domination. But the true test was yet to come. Levi had promised the territorial officials a demonstration that would prove his methods could work with any horse, not just Ghost. To that end, Morrison had agreed to provide a second animal, a young mare named Tempest, who had been considered untrainable by conventional standards. Tempest had been brought from a ranch near Bozeman, where she had developed a reputation for unpredictable behavior and violent resistance to being saddled. 3 different trainers had worked with her over the past year, and all had concluded that she was simply too dangerous to be useful. As Morrison led Tempest into the corral, the crowd's murmur grew louder. The mare was clearly agitated by the presence of so many strangers, her eyes rolling white with fear, her body tense with the kind of nervous energy that often preceded explosive behavior. "This," Levi announced, "is what real challenge looks like." He approached Tempest with the same calm patience he had shown Ghost, but the mare's reaction was immediate and violent. She reared, struck out with her front hooves, and retreated to the far corner of the corral with the kind of defensive aggression that had earned her reputation as untrainable. The crowd fell silent, suddenly understanding that they were about to witness either a triumph that would validate everything they had heard about Levi's methods, or a disaster that might end with serious injury or death. For long minutes, Levi simply stood in the center of the corral, while Tempest pressed herself against the far fence, her breathing harsh and rapid, her entire body radiating the kind of fear that came from expecting pain. The crowd watched in tense silence as nothing seemed to happen, no dramatic confrontation, no immediate breakthrough, just a blind man standing quietly while a terrified horse tried to disappear into the wooden rails. "What's he doing?" someone whispered, the question carrying clearly in the still air. "He's listening," Sarah replied, her voice full of quiet confidence. "He's letting her tell him what she needs." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Levi began to move. Not toward Tempest, but in a loose circle around the corral, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He was giving the mare space while establishing his own presence as something calm and patient, rather than demanding and aggressive. As Levi moved, he began to speak, not commands or training cues, but the kind of gentle, rhythmic monologue that had worked so well with Ghost. His voice carried stories of other horses he had known, descriptions of quiet meadows and cool streams, the kind of peaceful imagery that seemed designed to replace fear with something approaching curiosity. "That's it," he said softly as Tempest's breathing began to slow. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. Nobody's going to force you to do anything you're not ready for." The change in Tempest was gradual but unmistakable. Her ears, which had been pinned flat against her skull, began to swivel toward the sound of Levi's voice. Her stance shifted from defensive crouch to cautious attention. Most importantly, her eyes began to track Levi's movements with interest rather than fear. "Look at her ears," Dr. Webb murmured to Commissioner Harrison. "She's actually listening to him now." 20 minutes passed before Levi made his next move. Instead of approaching Tempest directly, he called Ghost over to him, and the big stallion responded immediately, moving with the fluid grace that had become his trademark. The sight of another horse responding so calmly to human contact seemed to have a profound effect on Tempest. If Ghost could trust this strange, gentle human, perhaps she could consider the possibility as well. "Horses are herd animals," Levi explained to the watching crowd, his voice never losing its calm, conversational tone. "They learn as much from watching each other as they do from direct experience. Tempest is seeing that Ghost feels safe with me, and that information is more valuable than anything I could try to force her to accept." Using Ghost as a kind of ambassador, Levi began to work closer to Tempest. The stallion's presence seemed to create a buffer zone of safety that allowed the mare to tolerate human proximity without triggering her flight response. When Levi finally extended his hand toward Tempest, she didn't flee instead. She stretched her neck forward just far enough to investigate his scent. "There you are," Levi said quietly, as Tempest's nose brushed his palm. "You're curious, aren't you? Wondering if maybe not all humans are the same." The first touch was electric. Tempest jerked back as if burned, but she didn't retreat to the fence. Instead, she stood her ground, processing the sensation of gentle contact from a human hand that offered no threat, demanded no submission, simply extended an invitation to trust. What happened next took the watching crowd's breath away. Moving with infinite patience, Levi managed to slip the rope halter over Tempest's head, not by force or surprise, but by waiting until she was ready to accept it. The mare stood perfectly still as the halter settled into place, her eyes wide with what looked like amazement that the process had involved no pain, no struggle, no violence. "Gentlemen," Commissioner Harrison said quietly to his fellow officials, "I think we're witnessing something that will change how we approach animal training throughout the territory." But Levi wasn't finished. With Tempest now wearing the halter and standing calmly beside Ghost, he demonstrated the final element that set his methods apart from conventional training. He asked the mare's permission before attempting to mount her. "I'm going to put my hands on your back now," he told Tempest, his voice carrying the same calm authority he had once used to reassure nervous soldiers. "If you don't want this, all you have to do is move away. I won't chase you, won't punish you, won't try to force you into anything." Tempest stood motionless as Levi's hands settled on her back, her breathing steady and calm. When he slowly lifted himself onto her back, she turned her head to look at him with what could only be described as wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe that this experience was so different from what she had learned to expect from humans. The ride that followed was brief but transformative. Tempest moved with careful, measured steps, responding to Levi's gentle guidance with the kind of willing cooperation that spoke of genuine partnership rather than enforced obedience. When Levi dismounted after a single circuit of the corral, the mare remained close to him, clearly reluctant to end their connection. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Applause erupted from every corner of the viewing area, and people pressed forward to get a closer look at the mare, who had been transformed from untrainable terror to willing partner in less than an hour. "Remarkable, Doctor," Webb said, shaking his head in amazement. "Absolutely remarkable. Mr. Boone, what you've accomplished here today will revolutionize our understanding of animal psychology." But as the officials gathered around to discuss implementation plans and funding arrangements, Levi found himself thinking not of future success, but of the moment when Tempest had first allowed him to touch her. That instant of trust, freely given by an animal who had every reason to fear human contact, represented everything he had learned about the power of patience over force, understanding over domination. Sarah approached as the crowd began to disperse, her face glowing with pride and something deeper, the recognition that they had witnessed not just a successful demonstration, but the birth of a new way of thinking about the relationship between humans and animals. "You did it," she said simply. "You proved that Fletcher was right about everything." Levi nodded, his hand resting on Ghost's neck, while Tempest stood quietly nearby, no longer the terrified, aggressive animal who had entered the corral an hour earlier. "No," he replied quietly. "We did it. All of us, Ghost, Tempest, Fletcher's vision, your support, even the crowd who came here willing to believe that there might be a better way." As the sun reached its zenith over Cedar Ridge, casting sharp shadows across the corral, where 2 horses and 1 man had just proven that understanding was stronger than force, Levi felt the deep satisfaction that comes from fulfilling a promise made to a dead friend and a living horse who had never stopped believing in the possibility of partnership. 2 years later, the sign at the entrance to the valley read, "Fletcher Boone Ranch, Healing through Partnership." The words were carved into a piece of weathered oak that had come from the tree where Levi and Ghost had spent their first morning together, and beneath them hung a smaller plaque bearing Fletcher's final words from his letter. Some bonds are strong enough to carry whatever weight the future places upon them. Sarah stood in the doorway of the ranch house they had built together, watching as Levi worked with a young cavalry horse that had been brought from Fort Ellis. The animal had been written off as untrainable after a cannon explosion had left him terrified of sudden noises. But under Levi's patient guidance, he was beginning to remember that not all loud sounds meant danger. The ranch had grown far beyond what any of them had initially envisioned. What had started as a simple horse training facility had evolved into something more comprehensive, a place where both animals and their human partners could learn new ways of relating to each other. Veterans came from across the territory to work with horses that understood trauma, while settlers brought animals that had been deemed impossible to gentle using conventional methods. Ghost, now 7 years old and in the prime of his life, had become more than just Levi's partner. He had become a teacher for other horses, showing them through his own calm confidence that humans could be trusted. His presence in the training corrals had an almost magical effect on frightened animals, offering them proof that healing was possible even after the worst kinds of betrayal. The white feather that Sarah had watched fall from Ghost's mane on that significant morning 2 years earlier now sat preserved in a small frame on their mantelpiece, a reminder of the moment when both horse and man had finally let go of the grief that had been weighing them down. But it was no longer a symbol of loss. It had become a symbol of transformation, of the possibility that pain could be transmuted into purpose if one was willing to be patient with the process. "How's Thunder coming along?" Sarah asked as Levi approached the house, Ghost following behind him with the easy companionship that had become their trademark. "Better every day," Levi replied, settling into the rocking chair they had placed on the front porch specifically for moments like these. "He actually let me put a saddle on him this morning without flinching. I think he's beginning to understand that we're not going to force him to forget what happened. We're just helping him remember that not everything has to be frightening." The philosophy that had guided Levi's work with Ghost had become the foundation for everything they did at Fletcher Boone Ranch. They didn't try to erase trauma or pretend that painful experiences hadn't occurred. Instead, they helped both horses and humans develop new associations, new possibilities, new ways of moving forward while still honoring what they had survived. Dr. Webb had become a regular visitor, documenting their methods and preparing a comprehensive manual that would be distributed to horse trainers throughout the American West. His initial skepticism had been replaced by evangelical enthusiasm for what he now called empathetic training, an approach that recognized animals as individuals, deserving of respect rather than simply as property to be dominated. "There's a letter from the territorial governor," Sarah said, handing Levi an official-looking envelope. "I think it's about that proposal for establishing training centers in other counties." Levi opened the letter carefully, his fingers tracing the embossed seal that marked it as official correspondence. As Sarah read it aloud, he found himself thinking of Fletcher and wondering what his old commanding officer would make of how far his vision had expanded. The letter confirmed what they had hoped. The territorial government was prepared to fund the establishment of 3 additional training centers based on the Fletcher Boone model. Levi would serve as the overall director, traveling between locations to train staff and ensure consistency of methods, while Sarah would manage the educational component that had become an increasingly important part of their mission. 3 more centers, Sarah mused. That means we could help hundreds of horses every year, maybe thousands over time. "And their human partners," Levi added. "That's just as important." The transformation in Levi himself had been as remarkable as any of the changes they had witnessed in the horses. The uncertain, grief-stricken veteran who had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 years earlier had been replaced by a man with clear purpose and unshakable confidence in his calling. His blindness, once a source of limitation and frustration, had become a tool that allowed him to perceive things that sighted people missed, the subtle changes in breathing that indicated fear or relaxation, the quality of movement that revealed an animal's emotional state, the profound significance of trust offered by creatures who had learned to expect betrayal. As evening settled over the ranch, Levi and Sarah made their customary walk through the corrals and pastures, checking on the dozen horses currently in various stages of training and rehabilitation. Each animal represented a story of transformation, a testament to the power of patience and understanding over force and domination. Thunder, the artillery-shy cavalry horse, stood peacefully in his stall, no longer flinching at every unexpected sound. Bella, a mare who had been abused by a previous owner, now sought out human contact rather than fleeing from it. Storm, a stallion who had been considered too aggressive for safe handling, had learned to channel his energy into cooperative work rather than destructive rebellion. Fletcher would be proud, Sarah said as they completed their circuit and returned to the house where Ghost waited for them on the front porch. I think he knew, Levi replied, settling beside his partner and feeling the familiar weight of the stallion's head on his shoulder. I think somehow he knew exactly how all of this would turn out. The ranch had brought them more than professional success. It had brought them a community of people who understood that healing was possible even after the worst kinds of damage. That trust could be rebuilt even after the most profound betrayals, that partnerships forged in mutual respect were stronger than any bonds created through dominance and fear. As stars began to appear in the clear Montana sky, Levi reached into his pocket and touched the cavalry medal that still accompanied him everywhere. It no longer represented a life that had ended too soon, but rather a foundation of service that had simply taken new forms. The skills he had learned as a soldier, patience under pressure, the ability to read situations quickly and accurately, the understanding that leadership meant serving others rather than commanding them, had proven perfectly suited to his new calling. Ghost stirred against his shoulder, the stallion's breathing deep and peaceful in the way that indicated complete contentment. The horse, who had once been unable to trust any human, was now the foundation of a program that had helped hundreds of animals and their partners find healing through understanding. What do you think, old friend? Levi asked quietly. Ready for whatever comes next? Ghost's answer came in the form of a gentle nudge against Levi's chest, followed by the kind of soft whicker that had become his signature expression of contentment. It was a sound that seemed to say that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together as partners who had learned that the strongest bonds were forged not through conquest, but through mutual respect, not through dominance, but through trust freely given and carefully honored. The story that had begun with a blind veteran and a supposedly untamable horse had become something far larger, a testament to the possibility that even the deepest wounds could heal when approached with patience, understanding, and the recognition that every creature, human or animal, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. It was Fletcher's vision made manifest, his final gift to a world that too often confused strength with the willingness to inflict pain. As night settled fully over Fletcher Boone Ranch, Levi and Sarah and Ghost shared the comfortable silence of partners who had found their purpose and were content to let it unfold. One day, one horse, one small act of healing at a time.